When you sit down to watch a new movie, how often do you recognize the directing style? Can you tell who it is right off the bat? Or do you have to wait until the end credit scene to find out? Most of the time, it's the latter. This is because many mainstream movies follow a similar, simplistic format in terms of the cinematography, lighting, editing, basically any sort of audiovisual element. Why? Well, because it works time and time again. Lots of directors blend styles with each other, and sometimes it is difficult to differentiate. The most interesting and unique directors are the ones who create their own style of filmmaking entirely and are distinguishable from the rest of the crowd. These directors can be considered auteurs, implementing their own unique style in all of their work. These auteurs shape all elements of the movie, leaving their mark in every corner of the production. Usually, an auteur will use the same sort of style throughout their films, making them a visionary rather than a one-hit wonder, and there is no one that does this better than Wes Anderson. The concept auteur refers only to the director. This is because they have superiority in all production stages and essentially shape the film to be what it is. Wes Anderson not only directs movies, but he is also credited with writing and producing, as well as being known to have contributions in other areas of production, such as cinematography and set design. Over the course of 9 movies and 20 years, Anderson has proved over and over again that he is a true auteur, producing visually unique films, all consistent in aesthetic and embodying the same general underlying theme. His movies are easily identifiable due to his strong color palette choices and emphasis on symmetry and composition. Wes Anderson has established himself as one of the most idiosyncratic directors through his distinct visual aesthetic and emphasis on youth. Now, I know that I already mentioned Wes Anderson can be considered an auteur filmmaker, but what does that mean? To define an auteur, first I will outline auteur theory, because as you can guess, they go hand in hand. The idea of an auteur in auteur theory actually surfaced in the 1950s. In the early days of Hollywood, the films released placed an emphasis on either the stars involved or the movie production company. It was never the director. This all began to change in the 50s when directors started to get more creative with their filmmaking, most notably altering how they told the story with the camera. Instead of using the camera only as a conduit to display the script, auteurs and aspiring directors began to use the camera as their own lens to tell the story in their own way. Notice the difference? It's a much more subjective way of filmmaking, and frankly it proves to be successful most times as it stands out from the rest of the crowd, providing a unique perspective. The criteria for an auteur is broken down into 3 categories. First, the director must have technical competence. This mark is pretty easy to hit for most directors. Typically, if you are directing a film or video, you have a general knowledge of the required technology involved and can carry out these tasks yourself, although you don't have to. Technical competence is fundamental in movie making, and this skill set is displayed in different ways between directors. Second, the auteur must have a signature aesthetic style. This could refer to the color schemes used or the composition of shots, anything visual that is repetitive yet relevant. This aesthetic style should be unique and recognizable to all audiences. The last point that defines an auteur is interior meaning. I mentioned before that these directors are very subjective. This is where that idea comes into play. Their movies are reflective of the director's own personality and give insight to their outlook on life. Taking a step back and looking at a director's entire discography can be beneficial in decoding how they create each of their films and what makes these films a distinct reflection of the director. In the case of Wes Anderson, he is continuously crafting stories that are rooted in ideas of youth and childhood, which can be interpreted as him reliving his childhood or carrying out dreams he had as a kid. It is quite evident that he does not want to make films with themes that are too mature, but this does not mean that his works are suited for children. He does present themes that are somewhat dark, mostly dealing with family loss, but they always have a lighter feel to it, as if a child was telling the story, naive to the darkness of the actual subjects. After analyzing 6 of Anderson's films, Rushmore, The Royal Tenenbaums, The Life Aquatic, Fantastic Mr. Fox, Moonrise Kingdom, and The Grand Budapest Hotel, it is quite evident that he is a true auteur. As I previously mentioned, technical ability is probably the easiest hurdle of auteur theory to overcome. A director basically just has to prove that they know what is going on technically, and honestly, most of them meet this requirement. Anderson's technical ability is demonstrated through his unique camera movement and composition. Now, anyone can construct an interesting camera angle or movement, but what makes Anderson so outstanding is the way he uses these certain movements to tell the story. It is not just a stylistic choice, but also a narrative choice. Let me break this down. Wes Anderson always wants the audience to see the whole picture. He wants viewers to have all the information. Every detail from every angle is important. There is no secret hiding beneath the visuals that are shown. This is particularly interesting to note when comparing to other directors because some will hide various aspects of a scene to convey a certain feeling or message to the audience, often not showing the whole picture so that viewers are left on the edge of their seat, wondering what they will uncover next. Not Wes, though. Instead of this, Anderson uses certain camera angles to put the entire scene on display, not withholding any information to the audience. One of the ways he does this is through his constant use of whip pans. These shots are frequent in all of his movies and provide a better sense of the scene. For example, the introduction to Moonrise Kingdom.
In order to show you how a big symphony...
By using the whip pan here, audiences get a sense of the setting in a certain space. The characters are cleverly blocked in relation to one another, and the camera follows them based on their movement or dialogue. This way, viewers are in tune to the setting and its relationship to the characters, placing an emphasis on the visuals and how they tell the story, rather than the script itself. The Grand Budapest Hotel is crawling with whip pans. This movie features so many shots like this that it truly became a part of the story. When a whip pan takes place, the action or intensity of the scene is immediately heightened, prompting the audience to immerse themselves in the action quickly. The whip pan indicates a quick change in tempo and helps keep the overall pace of the movie. The pacing of Anderson's films can be described as quick. The cuts are quick, the action is quick, even the dialogue in most cases is quick. And this is not necessarily a bad thing as it adds to his personal directing style. Frankly, the fastness of his pacing really makes audiences take note of scenes that are not so fast. This juxtaposition places a huge emphasis on these slower scenes and invites audiences to really take in the dialogue for once, rather than the visuals. This tactic is most effective in the scene from the Royal Tenenbaums when Royal tells Etheline that he is dying.
What are you talking about? What's happening?
This is a pretty long static shot with not much to look at other than the two characters in frame. All of a sudden, the audience is caught off guard. Instead of the quick cuts to action and the interlocking storylines, viewers are asked to zero in closely on this one specific moment, giving light to the importance of the scene's contents and making it memorable in comparison to the rest of the movie. Another way that Anderson shows off his technical ability is through his long take scenes. Specifically, I want to mention Eli's overdose scene in the Royal Tenenbaums. This scene features all of the characters and is shot in one take. A shot like this requires an incredible amount of planning and technical competence, as everything must be timed accordingly and there is no room for error. A lot of this is dependent on the actors, yes, but it is the director who is responsible for the final product, so it is their duty to make sure everything goes according to plan. And with a scene like this, that can't be easy. Another notable mention for his technical competence is the tour of the Belafonte, Steve Zissou's boat in The Life Aquatic. Again, shot all in one take, this requires a lot of planning. Shout out to the set design of this scene too, because the camera would not work if this aspect was not thoroughly planned out as well. Here, the camera moves like the elevator in Willy Wonka. It goes up, down, left, right, anywhere possible really, and works to show each room on the boat in real time and how they are situated in relation to each other, getting the whole picture. On top of all this camera movement, there is also character movement. Things are happening in every room all at once. The camera just happens to be going through these rooms one at a time. Once again, Anderson has showed off his technical chops, this time showing off his patience and thorough planning with such a large-scale setting, all in one take. The second thing that auteur theory calls for is a strong, unique visual aesthetic, which, as you've probably noticed by now, Wes Anderson flourishes in. This is his strongest asset. The aesthetics that he creates for each movie are so distinct, so colorful, and so repetitive that they have long-lasting impressions and deem Anderson as a visual genius. Where do I begin when talking about the aesthetic of Wes Anderson? There are some specific visual cues that can indicate that you were watching an Anderson original, like, is Bill Murray there? Is Owen Wilson? Are there chapters? Title cards? Is there a play? Is Bill Murray in a love triangle? The first thing that you would probably notice as being distinctly Anderson is his intense use of color. Each of his movies have a different scheme, all consisting of maybe 3 to 5 focal colors. In Rushmore, it's a navy blue, red, and white. The Royal Tenenbaums features more oranges, pinks, and browns. The Life Aquatic has everyone dressed in shades of blue with accents of red and white. Fantastic Mr. Fox is all browns and oranges. Moonrise Kingdom is heavily saturated in yellows and greens. And finally, Grand Budapest Hotel displays various shades of pinks and purples. This may not seem like much, but Anderson sticks to these palettes strictly, not letting any unwanted color enter the frame in any way. His strategy to do this creates a cohesive setting or world that the film takes place in. Everything, and I mean everything, is meticulously planned out, specifically in terms of color. No shade of red will enter Moonrise Kingdom unless absolutely necessary. In Rushmore, change of color is actually used to signify a change in character. At the end of the film, Max is wearing green rather than his regular blue and red, insinuating that he is now a changed person from the Max we were introduced to at the beginning. Otherwise, green does not appear in the movie at all aside from grass, emphasizing the importance of the chosen color and insinuating that it has a much deeper meaning. Most of this coloring is natural. By that I mean it is not recolored after shooting in post-production, but rather the sets, props, and costumes were all designed in these colors in real life. It's a little bit vintage and a little bit perfect. Aside from his clever use of color, you may also recognize Anderson through his set design and use of symmetry. Many shots throughout these movies are symmetrical. It's just his style and it works well. It is something that takes a lot of time and patience to execute correctly, and boy, does Wes Anderson execute this correctly every time. Some of his most memorable scenes are based in symmetry, either providing a symmetrical setting and having characters move asymmetrically throughout the frame, or the opposite, moving the characters symmetrically through an asymmetrical environment. Confusing, right? Just remember, it's all based in symmetry. These sets are distinctly crafted for the camera. Many of them look like they are taken right out of a fairy tale. Each movie features a completely different setting, allowing Anderson to start fresh again, tweaking the details of his already defined aesthetic. Because Fantastic Mr. Fox is stop motion, literally every set and character had to be created from scratch, so there was endless opportunities for Anderson to put his own personal touch on the project. In his live-action movies, the sets are dominated by specific details and color schemes that tie the whole setting together. This attention to detail helps the audience to connect with the overall film. The set designs are so unique and enticing that it makes you feel like you are really there. And Anderson does not let these set designs go to waste. In addition to always wanting to show the big picture in terms of information, by featuring so many wide-angle shots or long takes, it actually allows for the camera to show off all of the information about the sets as well. This is the most notable in The Life Aquatic, where the wide angles show off all the corners of the Belafonte, whether it be inside or out. Or in Grand Budapest Hotel when they are in the lobby of the hotel. In the Royal Tenenbaums, there are a few sets that are put on display through tracking shots like this one where Royal confesses he is not dying. These kinds of shots are chosen to show off the immense effort that went towards the set design and contribute to Anderson's overall aesthetic. Okay, so those are the main aspects that contribute to his distinct aesthetic, but there are a lot more little nuances that also play a role. For example, the use of letters. All of his movies have some sort of storyline that has to do with writing handwritten letters. Whether it is an exchange of letters or just one, you can bet that some sort of letter will appear in his movies and hold a noteworthy amount of importance. Another one is his fondness of using the same actors. As I mentioned before, Bill Murray is the obvious example, but after watching all of his movies, I was actually able to make a few more connections. Owen Wilson, Luke Wilson, Jason Schwartzman, Angelica Houston, Willem Dafoe, Jeff Goldblum, Adrian Brody. The list goes on and on. Recycling actors is not a typical thing for directors to do, especially not for every movie. Again, contributing to his uniqueness. Whether it is through title cards, maps, or diagrams, Wes Anderson is not afraid of putting text on screen, that's for sure. Most of his films are broken up into chapters, each featuring a theme title card indicating the switch. Many of the scenes that depict the characters planning something feature maps or diagrams that is accompanied by on-screen text. And if you haven't guessed it by now, yes, there are some specific Wes Anderson fonts as well. Funny enough, they're pretty mundane fonts like Helvetica and Futura, but Anderson gives them life, attaching them to his aesthetic and assisting the narrative. Or maybe you pick up on his recurring presentation of plays or shows within the movies. His characters are always either putting on a show or attending one. Max and Margot are both playwrights. Steve is presenting his work in a theater much like a play, and Susie is the star of a play. It's a smaller detail, but it's quite interesting to see that this is a relevant component in many of his films. I could probably talk about his aesthetic for hours because the elements and themes run so deep. Everything from the sets to the colors, to the costumes, to the camera placement, to the graphics is so well thought out and cohesive in every one of his movies. Unique aesthetic? Check. In order to reach auteur status, there is one more box to check off: interior meaning. And this is probably the most difficult one to achieve as a director. The basis of this is that the films that a director produces are a reflection of their own internal thinking or outlook on life. This varies greatly between directors and is what puts many of them over the edge, deeming them an auteur as opposed to just a filmmaker. After watching majority of Anderson's films, it is safe to say that his outlook on life is very youthful. Each film embodies a sort of youthful spirit in the costumes, settings, characters, colors, and most importantly, the narrative. I mentioned earlier that Anderson holds the writing credit on most of his films, with the exception of Fantastic Mr. Fox and Grand Budapest Hotel, which were both adapted screenplays, so I will not be talking about them in terms of narrative. But his other films I have been talking about in this video essay are full of youth, whether it is embodied by children or adults. Looking at his films as a whole, it becomes quite apparent that the stories are all childlike in some way or another. I talked before about how he always splits up his movies into chapters, kind of like a book. These separated segments begin with pastel-colored title cards, reminiscent of a storybook, perhaps even a bedtime story. In some cases, like Moonrise Kingdom and the Royal Tenenbaums, there is even a narrator, clearly defining the different parts of the book. It's almost like the viewer is stepping into a storybook, inviting them to relive a part of their youth that they may have forgotten about. Not only are these films comparable to children's storybooks, but they also act as a collection of childhood dreams. Through the auteur lens, we can assume that these are Anderson's own dreams. Being the top of his graduating class and falling in love for the first time, being a part of a famous family, becoming a marine biologist who sails the seas looking for new discoveries and adventure, being the rebel at a sleepaway camp who causes chaos yet comes out on top, and then the argument that Wes chooses his film's narratives to match his outlook, being the lobby boy of an exquisite hotel. All of these have a flourishing sense of adventure and excitement, which can only be fulfilled by someone who is tapped into their youth and has a childlike mindset. It is apparent that Anderson places himself as the protagonist in each of the films, acting out a childhood dream of his own. Let's take a medium dive into these films to explore how they each embody this youthful spirit differently. Rushmore features Max, a teenager who is on every extracurricular at his school, yet he does not carry the same enthusiasm for his grades. Max just wants to grow up and find love. He is not interested in experiencing the age he is. He soon meets Mr. Bloom, an older man who has lost sight of anything amusing until he befriends Max and starts to come back to life. Both of these characters carry a different sense of youth with them. Max is eager to grow up and move on, but his naivety is showing his age and slowing him down greatly. Mr. Bloom, on the other hand, is learning how to find his youth again through Max. There is even an insanely fun montage of Mr. Bloom and Max carrying out a prank war on each other. It doesn't get more youthful than that. This could be a reflection of Anderson's own struggle to grow up, showcasing a teen wanting to so badly, but then showing the juxtaposition of someone who grew up too fast and deeply regrets it.
You know, you and Hammond deserve each other. You're both little children.
His next film is The Royal Tenenbaums, which honestly is full of youthful spirit. In terms of the Tenenbaum children, well, They never really grew up. Their childhood was so influential that it shaped many of their career and life choices, as presented to the viewers in the introduction and flashback segments. They even wear the same clothes that they did as kids, insinuating that they never actually grew up and are still living their childhood. This wardrobe could be an aesthetic choice, but symbolically it means so much more. Margot, Chaz, and Richie all seem sort of lost in life, until they return to their childhood home in which they begin to find themselves again. Once again, emphasizing childhood. And then there's Royal, who, just like Mr. Bloom, so desperately wants to relive his youth. Here, we get an awesome montage of Royal with his grandkids doing different childlike activities, which is honestly pretty similar to the prank war montage I just talked about. Catch my drift? The main point to take away from this film is that no one is too old to experience youthful energy. Spirit will never die, and anyone can be a kid again. In The Life Aquatic, we meet Steve Zissou, a marine biologist/captain that is pushing retirement but still craves adventure on the sea. Steve's spirit is ultimately youthful, even though his delivery is quite monotone. Despite the skepticism and declining momentum, Steve insists on one last adventure in order to successfully discover the jaguar shark and avenge his friend. He may be a burnout professionally, but he is still holding onto his youthful spirit by continuing exploration and encouraging his crew to be more adventurous. In the final shot, he is literally holding onto his youth, carrying a little boy out of the theater as he announces he will not be retiring anytime soon. Steve may be old, but he has a great grasp on his youthful spirit and gives no signs of letting go anytime soon. Again, a reflection of Anderson himself. Moonrise Kingdom is Anderson's only movie with actual children as the protagonists. Before this, it was always the adults who were embodying this sense of youth and not letting it go. But this time, it is much more accurate as the theme is presented through youth themselves. Unlike what we have seen in his previous works, the kids are acting like kids and the adults are acting like adults. This time, the theme of youth is a little bit more obvious, considering most of the characters are kids. It's a different, more authentic depiction of youth that Anderson hadn't explored yet and fits nicely into his repertoire. I can't speak much about Fantastic Mr. Fox or Grand Budapest Hotel because they are not his own stories. However, they both exude an immense amount of youthfulness. Fantastic Mr. Fox is literally a children's book, but also the character of Mr. Fox is desperately trying to relive his youth by returning to his previous ways of theft and adventure. Zero, similar to Max, wants to grow up rather quick, but Gustav insists he hang on to his innocence for as long as possible. On top of the consistent emphasis on youth, each movie has a strong family theme to it that usually starts off kind of negative, but ends on a more positive note. The protagonist experiences either death or abandonment, and as a result, there is a growing need to create a new familial community. Whether it is through reconnecting with estranged family members or creating an entirely new unit, the protagonist is always found by the end of the film. One more thing I want to point out is Anderson's ability to present hard-hitting information, but then make light of the situation. It may be a depressing storyline, but Anderson does not see it that way. Similar to a kid not understanding the circumstances of a tragic situation. Instead of wallowing in the dark facts, he encourages people to see the light at the end of the tunnel and focus on other details that will make this darkness smaller. In Moonrise Kingdom, Sam is an orphan, which is not the most lighthearted narrative, but the dialogue that accompanies the emergence of this fact makes it easier to swallow. Wes Anderson's interior meaning is quite simple if you ask me. It's all based in youth and the idea of never losing sight of this feeling. He sees the world as one big playground, full of opportunities for adventure in every corner. He never lets go of his youthful spirit, giving it to each of his protagonists to embody in their own story. All of Anderson's movies feel like he is living out a different childhood dream between the narrative and aesthetic. And more importantly, these aspects are present throughout all of his films. Wes Anderson is a true visionary, cleverly designing unique spaces and characters that coincide with his own personal views on the world, and he produces this through the art of filmmaking. The camera is his tool to convey his perspective on certain subjects and make films that are ultimately himself, becoming a true auteur.